Hello, my name is Hallie, and have you ever been trapped in a glass case of emotion and you just wanted to know what part of your brain was responsible for this behavior? Well, with this review you can. Not only will we define emotion, but we'll also explore some of the theories that try to explain how our emotions are developed, and we'll also describe the regions of the brain that are responsible for our emotional processing. And by completing this review, you'll have a better ability to remember the theory behind universal emotions, and you can also attack questions such as the one at the bottom of the screen, which asks you to identify which of the theories best explains John's emotional response. The word emotion is derived from the same Latin root as motivation, and while motivation may describe why we perform certain actions, emotion is how we present ourselves in front of other people so that they know how we're feeling. And emotions can result in three types of reactions. The first being physiological. If you've ever been attracted to another person, you might have noticed that your heart rate or body temperature increased, or maybe even your respiration. And this is because you were triggering your autonomic system. And on top of that physiological reaction, you might have had some behavioral reactions where you smiled or waved at that person. And finally, there's a cognitive reaction where your brain tries to logically understand why you behave that way. Did I wave and smile at that person because I'm attracted to them, or did I feel socially obligated to do so? And as researchers began to dissect and evaluate the processing that occurs behind emotions, a researcher named Paul Ekman recognized that there are 7 types of universal emotions that people can interpret and process regardless of their cultural background. In fact, you might be able to determine what the 7 universal emotions are just by looking at this woman's facial expressions. The universal emotions are happiness, sadness, contempt, surprise, anger, disgust, and fear. There are 3 fundamental theories of emotion that we'll want to be familiar with for test day, and professional opinions don't all agree on which one of these theories are the best, and as MCAT exam takers, it's not our job to consider which of these is the most accurate. We just need to know the differences between the 3 theories in order to perform well on the MCAT. The first theory is the James Lange theory, and this theory says that it's due to changes in our physiological responses that elicit an emotional response. So if someone has a fear of spiders, we would expect that upon seeing a spider that they'd have an increase in heart rate. And it's this increase in heart rate, or this physiological change, that would elicit a fear response. By this same logic, if you were having a bad day and you were feeling sad, all you would have to do is physically smile in order to feel happier. The second theory is the Cannon-Bard theory. While the James Lange theory believed that our physiological responses created our emotional response, the Cannon-Bard theory believes that upon seeing a stimulus, that stimuli will be processed by the thalamus, and then the thalamus will trigger a simultaneous physiological response as well as an emotional response. So upon seeing a spider, the thalamus will process that information and then elicit the increase in heart rate and the fear response at the same time. And finally, the third theory is the Schachter-Singer theory, also called the two-factor theory. This theory believes that once you see a stimuli, that you have 2 simultaneous responses, a physiological change as well as a cognitive interpretation. And it's these 2 responses that come together to create your emotional response. So upon seeing a spider, we would have some form of physiological change, such as an increase in heart rate, and we would also be cognitively aware that we are afraid of the spider. And according to the two-factor theory, it's these 2 responses that come together to create our emotional response. Now that we've explored how emotions are formed, let's see how they influence our memories. If we have an emotional event, it will be processed by 2 different sensory systems, one being the explicit memory system, which is performed by the hippocampus in our temporal lobe, and this will create a memory about an emotion. The second system is the implicit memory system, which is performed by the amygdala, and this is an emotional memory. So let's say we have a person who is in a traumatic car wreck, and years down the road, they have a conversation where the word car accident comes up during the conversation. That person may have an immediate, unconscious emotional reaction to that phrase, and that's something that's out of their control, so that's an implicit memory. However, if they want to consciously think about what happened that night during their REC, they would have to explore their explicit memory. However, the explicit and implicit memory systems can work together to enhance your memories. If you take an event like graduation, if you treat it only as an explicit memory, you might remember wearing this really strange outfit and a weird hat and walking across the stage, getting a handshake and a piece of paper, and really not being that big of a deal. However, if you incorporate your implicit memory into that memory of graduation, it really enhances that event. You might remember the support of your family, that sense of accomplishment, and that makes it a better memory for you. So these two systems can work together. Finally, we also want to be familiar with the regions of the brain that are responsible for processing our emotions. And the first is the limbic system, which is located just below the cerebrum, and it receives stimuli from our prefrontal cortex as well as our sensory systems in order to process our emotions. And there are three key structures within the limbic system. The first being the amygdala. The amygdala is able to process external cues and learn how a person's environment should influence their emotions. And the amygdala is associated with our fear response as well as our ability to interpret facial expressions. The hippocampus is predominantly responsible for creating and retrieving long-term memories, but these memories give us emotional context. And the hypothalamus is part of the endocrine system, and it's able to release neurotransmitters. So this means that it is able to link our emotional response with our physiological responses. We also want to be familiar with the prefrontal cortex, which is the anterior portion of the frontal lobe. And the prefrontal cortex is able to receive sensory stimuli from our brainstem and coordinate how we want to respond to that stimuli. So this is actually the cognitive portion of our emotional response. Let's try a couple of practice questions, such as this one regarding the theory of universal emotions. And the correct answer is C. Remember, universal emotions said that these 7 emotions are universal regardless of the cultural background. Answer choice C is the only option that doesn't have any cultural influence over the children's behavior. Let's try this question, which gives us a scenario and asks us to determine which of the 3 fundamental theories of emotion best describes this scenario. And the correct answer is C, the Schachter-Singer theory. And this is because John became cognitively aware of his physiological changes, and it was these 2 reactions together that elicited his emotional response, even though the date didn't go so well. And finally, let's attack this question, which gives us a patient who experienced a trauma and asks us to predict which portion of his brain was damaged based off of his symptomology. And the correct answer is the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for our fear processing, and since he is no longer experiencing fear, it's most likely that he had damage to the amygdala. To highlight the key points that we want to remember for the MCAT is that our emotions are based on 3 components: our cognitive, behavioral, and physiological responses, and that there are 7 universal emotions that people can interpret or exhibit regardless of their cultural background, and that there are 3 theories of emotion that try to relate our physiological and cognitive processing and determine how that influences our emotional response. And finally, that the limbic system is very important in our emotional processing and memory. Well, that's what the MCAT exam writers expect you to know about emotions. Thank you for joining me, and best of luck keeping that amygdala under control as your MCAT day approaches.